The year was 1854, and the small Spanish village of Calves had long since accustomed itself to silence. Its streets, narrow and pale beneath the weight of limestone dust, seemed to exhale only the sounds of hooves on cobblestone, the clatter of wooden shutters, and the distant toll of a church bell that rarely moved. But on one evening in late autumn, silence itself began to carry a sound that no villager had ever heard before. It began in a farmhouse at the edge of the settlement, in a kitchen lit only by the weak, flickering breath of 2 candles. A boy no older than 7 sat before a table where a blank book had been placed. The book belonged to his father, a laborer who kept it for lists of grain and tools, though he had never learned to write more than his own name. The pages before the child were empty. His mother, stirring broth at the hearth, glanced toward him now and then, expecting him to grow bored. Yet instead of tracing lines or doodling shapes, the boy began to speak. At first his voice was little more than a whisper. A line, a phrase, a steady rhythm that followed no childish song. The words came measured, deliberate, like those of someone reading aloud. His mother stopped stirring. She turned. The boy's eyes remained fixed on the page, but there was nothing there. The candlelight glistened on pure white parchment. Still, his lips moved, his voice carrying a cadence familiar only from Sunday Mass. The words were Latin. The verses unmistakable. In principio erat verbum, in the beginning was the word. His mother froze, the ladle dripping onto the stone floor. She had never taught him scripture. He had never been inside the monastery school, nor had he studied even the simplest prayers beyond what was required to recite before bed. Yet here he was, reciting the opening of the Gospel of John, each syllable clear, his gaze never wavering from the empty sheet before him. Panic rose in her chest, sharp and breathless. She called for her husband, who entered from the stable, smelling of hay and sweat. He frowned at the sight, yet when he heard the child's voice, his face drained of color. The father made the sign of the cross, whispering a prayer under his breath. His son was reading aloud, yes, but there were no words to be read. That night, the family summoned the parish priest. Father Mateo was a man of strict austerity, gray-haired and iron-eyed, known for chastising those who entertained superstition. When he entered the small farmhouse, he brought with him the heavy scent of incense and authority. He took the book from the boy's hands and flipped through its pages. Blank. Entirely blank. He pressed the child to read again. The boy obeyed. With small, pale fingers resting lightly on the parchment, he began once more, E lux in tenebris lucet, and the light shineth in darkness. The words emerged with a calm certainty, his young voice steady in the dim room. The priest's own lips parted. He knew the passage well. He could follow it word for word in his own memory. But still he could not reconcile what his eyes told him, that the book was utterly devoid of ink. The candles guttered in the draught, throwing shadows that seemed to bend unnaturally along the walls. No one spoke. For a long moment, the only sound was the boy's recitation, a hymn of invisible words rolling out into the silence. Then Father Mateo slammed the book shut, the sound startling in the small space. He gathered himself, declaring that the child must not be allowed to perform such things again. Temptations of the devil come in guises of light, he warned gravely. Yet his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. The boy was sent to bed. The family sat in uneasy quiet, staring at the book. The father placed it high upon a shelf, as if distance itself could render it less dangerous. The mother wept softly, clutching her rosary. They told no neighbors. But within a week, the story spread regardless. Children talk, servants whisper. Soon the village knew that a boy on the edge of town could read what was not there. And so began the tale that would haunt Calves for decades, a story passed down not in records or ledgers but in whispers and fragments. Some said the boy was blessed, a vessel chosen by God. Others insisted he was cursed, his voice borrowed by demons eager to mock the sacred word. No one could say why he had been chosen, nor why the blank pages revealed themselves only to him. Yet all agreed upon one thing, once a child begins to see words where none exist, innocence cannot be reclaimed. A page, once written upon, cannot return to purity. And in the case of the boy from Calves, the words written in nothingness would soon prove heavier than any scripture inked by human hand. What began as a whisper in candlelight was destined to grow into a story of dread, of fascination, and of silence too deep to endure. The child who could read the ink that wasn't there had begun his first chapter. And no one, not his family, not his priest, not his village, would ever escape the weight of it. Calves was a village suspended in time, caught between the fading light of tradition and the creeping shadows of a changing world. Its houses, whitewashed and uneven, seemed to lean against one another for support, as if the town itself feared the open sky. Narrow streets wound like hesitant threads, and the limestone dust that coated them glimmered in the sun with a muted, almost ghostly shimmer. The air carried the faint scent of burning wood from hearths, mingled with the earthy musk of animals and the subtle perfume of wildflowers growing in cracks between stones. At first glance, nothing about Calves suggested it was a place of mystery. Yet beneath its quiet, every corner seemed to harbor a story, a secret kept carefully from strangers and even from neighbors. The villagers themselves were wary people, accustomed to hardship and the slow rhythms of rural life. Farmers rose with the sun and bent to their fields, their hands thick with soil and calluses, while their children chased chickens across uneven yards, learning early that survival required both caution and wit. Families attended mass regularly, their faith as much a shield against fear as a beacon of hope. Yet, superstition thrived alongside devotion. Tales of wandering spirits, hidden curses, and whispers from the old forests were never dismissed entirely. They lingered in the air like the dust, settling invisibly into every corner of consciousness. It was into this world that the boy was born. His family was modest, neither impoverished nor wealthy, tending a small plot of land on the village's edge. The father, a quiet man with shoulders curved from labor, worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk. The mother, equally resilient, managed the household with a firm hand softened by gentle affection. Their lives had always been ordinary, measured in harvests and prayers, in the rhythms of sowing and reaping. Yet the boy's birth, followed years later by his uncanny ability to read invisible words, shattered the ordinary and cast long shadows over the village's still, cautious peace. From the moment the whispers began, Calves became a town divided between curiosity and fear. Neighbors peeked through windows and doorways, straining to hear what might be happening within the small farmhouse. Some were drawn by the hope of witnessing a miracle, believing the boy's gift a sign of divine favor. Others recoiled, suspecting something far darker, an intrusion of the supernatural that could not be controlled or contained. Children, innocent and wide-eyed, gathered silently at fences, hoping to glimpse the boy and his ghostly words. Adults spoke in muted tones, careful to avoid drawing attention, wary of inviting God's judgment, or the devil's, upon themselves. The town itself seemed to respond to the boy's presence. Even the landscape appeared to bend subtly toward him. The wind through the trees carried a sharper chill, the shadows of the houses lengthened unnaturally at twilight, and the river that cut through the fields murmured as though it were speaking secrets to those who would listen. Livestock grew restless near the farmhouse, huddling in corners or pacing the edges of their pens as if sensing something unseen. Doors creaked open without wind, and hearth flames danced with unfamiliar intensity, yet no one dared to suggest a cause beyond what was visible and explainable. It was a village caught between what could be known and what was undeniable, yet incomprehensible. The cultural fabric of Calves further complicated the situation. Villagers were deeply Catholic, steeped in the rituals of Mass and confession, yet they clung to the older stories, the ones passed down from ancestors who had lived through famines, plagues, and wars. These tales spoke of children touched by spirits, of voices heard in empty rooms, of messages written in shadows. The boy's talent invoked these ancestral memories, stirring unease that was older than the village itself. People whispered in the squares about the reader of nothing, a moniker that traveled quickly, carrying both fascination and dread. The moniker was never spoken aloud in the church, it existed only in corners, in kitchens, and along the dusty paths where the sunlight fell dimly. The family struggled to reconcile the boy's abilities with their own understanding of the world. The mother, gentle yet determined, sought to protect him from exposure while simultaneously grappling with the awe that his gift inspired. She hid the blank books, covered the hearths, and pleaded with her neighbors to stay away. Yet the village's curiosity could not be contained. A silent tension developed between the boy's family and their community, an unspoken agreement that the boy must be seen but not questioned, witnessed but not touched. Every visit, every observation, was a delicate negotiation between wonder and terror. Even within the household, the lines between ordinary life and the uncanny blurred. Meals were prepared in silence, the mother's hands trembling as she stirred soups and baked bread. Candles flickered with unusual intensity, shadows twisting on the walls as though reflecting not just light but something else entirely. The father, practical and rooted in reality, paced at night, unsure whether to pray, to scold, or simply to watch. The boy, meanwhile, continued to sit before blank pages, speaking words that seemed to exist only for him, reciting phrases that would haunt those who listened long after the sound had faded. Calves, a village built on simplicity, humility, and hard work, found itself drawn into a web of mystery it could neither explain nor fully reject. Every corner of the town, the tavern where villagers met at dusk, the church where candles burned long into the night, the narrow alleys echoing with the clatter of boots, became part of a stage where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided. The boy's gift was not merely a curiosity, it was a lens through which the entire village began to see the fragility of perception, the instability of what they thought they knew, and the thin, trembling line between faith, fear, and the impossible. And so, the stage was set. Calves, with its quiet streets and shadowed corners, would become both witness and participant in a story of impossible words, invisible ink, and a child who read what should not exist. Every whisper, every glance, every cautious footstep across dusted streets would carry the weight of anticipation and dread, as the village came to understand that nothing in their world would ever feel ordinary again. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, when the sun hung low over the hills and the shadows stretched across the village like slow-moving ghosts, that the boy's talent first revealed its true, unsettling depth. At the edge of the farmhouse, in the modest room where the family kept their most treasured possessions, he sat once more before a blank book. The pages gleamed white, untouched by ink or pencil, yet when the boy placed his small fingers upon them, the words came, not in hesitation or murmur, but in a steady, deliberate voice that seemed almost older than the child himself. His mother, who had initially dismissed the first recitations as a strange trick or an innocent mistake, now watched in growing alarm. Her heart pounded as she realized the truth. He was reading lines that no one had written. Verses of scripture appeared perfectly intact, though she had never taught him to read them. Poems from distant lands, phrases in languages she could not understand, all poured from his lips with a clarity and confidence that was impossible for someone so young. The candlelight flickered across his face, highlighting the intensity in his eyes, the way his small jaw clenched with concentration, and the slight quiver of his hands as though he felt the weight of the words themselves. The father, summoned once more from the fields, watched with disbelief. He had seen much in his years, the harsh winters, failed crops, the fleeting cruelties of nature, but nothing prepared him for this. He knelt beside his son, touching the blank pages as if to confirm that they were, indeed, empty. And they were. Yet the words continued to emerge, sentences that conveyed knowledge the boy could not possibly possess, recalling events he could not have witnessed, describing distant towns and faces long gone. The father's practical mind sought explanations, imagining hidden ink, invisible scratches on the parchment, some clever deception. Yet he found none. Word of the phenomenon began to travel, cautiously at first. Neighbors, hearing whispers of the boy's gift, would stop by under the pretense of casual visits. They approached with a mixture of skepticism and fear, unwilling to fully commit to disbelief yet unprepared to accept the impossible. The boy's recitations grew bolder in these moments. When strangers were present, he read entire letters aloud, letters that had never existed, containing pleas and laments that were so precise, so achingly intimate, that those who listened felt the weight of lives they had never known. Some cried silently, recognizing the voices of lost relatives or friends. Others whispered that the child was touched by a force beyond comprehension, a vessel of knowledge both divine and terrible. The most unsettling part was not the recitation itself, but the boy's composure. He did not smile, nor did he show the hesitation of a child acting out a learned trick. His voice carried the certainty of someone delivering an urgent message, a warning, or a prophecy. Each syllable was deliberate, the rhythm measured as though the invisible words existed in some hidden dimension, waiting only for him to bring them into the audible world. His mother, torn between awe and fear, began to sleep poorly, haunted by the cadence of his voice replaying in her mind long after the candle flames had died down. Neighbors began to keep silent vigil, sitting just beyond the doorway, straining to hear without intruding. The boy seemed to sense the attention, reading with even greater precision, almost as if the presence of an audience sharpened the clarity of the invisible script. He read in Latin, in Spanish, in French, in tongues long forgotten by the village itself. Sometimes the passages were mundane, recounting simple details of past events. Other times, they were dark, describing misfortunes yet to come, secrets that no one in the household had revealed, or tragedies buried in the memories of villagers who preferred not to recall them. The effect was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Rumors grew, each retelling adding subtle embellishments. Children swore the boy could read not only books but the thoughts of adults. Farmers claimed he had recited the precise content of contracts and ledgers kept in distant towns. The village priest, though skeptical, was not immune. He had been called to witness the boy's readings and, despite his strict training in rational thought and theological study, found himself shaken. He documented the occurrences in secret, careful not to speak aloud what he had witnessed, fearing either ridicule or divine reprisal. He noted the precision of the words, the boy's unwavering attention to the invisible ink, and the unnatural calm with which he delivered phrases that seemed to exist somewhere between memory and prophecy. At night, the farmhouse became a locus of unease. Candlelight cast long, trembling shadows across the walls, making every corner a potential threshold between the visible and the hidden. The boy's voice, soft but persistent, recited lines that lingered in the air, twisting the very atmosphere of the room. Family members and visitors alike reported an uncanny chill, a sensation that the air itself had grown denser, more charged with an unseen presence. The simplest objects, the table, the books, the floorboards, seemed to hum faintly with anticipation, as though awaiting the revelation of words not yet born. Despite the growing fear, fascination could not be quelled. Scholars from nearby towns, curious clergy, and even itinerant doctors arrived to observe. Each left with more questions than answers. The boy passed tests that should have been impossible, reading passages in blank notebooks, repeating verses he had never been exposed to, recounting information that had no earthly origin. Yet he failed when asked to perform tasks that seemed ordinary, simple arithmetic, spelling common words, or recalling trivial events from the family's daily life. His genius was selective, focused entirely on the unseen script. This imbalance unnerved observers, forcing them to confront the inexplicable. By the end of the first week, the boy had become both a blessing and a burden. His gift inspired reverence in some, terror in others. The family, caught between pride and despair, could neither encourage nor fully suppress him. Their home became a place of silent expectation, where every evening brought the tension of unseen letters poised to speak through the child's lips. And as the boy's readings continued, it became clear that this was only the beginning, that what had started as a whisper on empty pages would grow into a story capable of unsettling an entire village, challenging the boundaries of faith, reason, and the fragile perception of reality itself. The news of the boy's ability traveled slowly at first, carried by whispers and cautious glances, but it inevitably reached the parish. Father Mateo, a man of austere demeanor and unwavering discipline, had long held sway over the spiritual and moral life of calves. His gray hair and stern eyes were a fixture in the community, and his sermons emphasized obedience, piety, and the dangers of temptation. When word reached him that a child in his village was reading words that did not exist, he could not dismiss it lightly. Such phenomena, he knew, required both vigilance and discernment. Miracles, if genuine, must be recognized, and deceptions, if present, must be corrected before they led souls astray. He arrived at the farmhouse unannounced, his heavy cloak brushing the floor, his rosary clutched tightly in one hand. The boy was seated at the table, a blank book before him, and his small face was illuminated by the wavering glow of 2 candles. His mother, trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation, ushered Father Mateo in, silently pleading for understanding and protection. The priest's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. There was nothing unusual in the book itself, no hidden marks, no stains, no faint traces of ink. Yet when he asked the boy to read, the words emerged clearly, faithfully, and with an authority that seemed entirely disproportionate to his tender age. "Recite the Gospel," Father Mateo commanded, his voice firm, concealing both doubt and apprehension. The boy obeyed, his small lips forming syllables that the priest knew by heart, every intonation precise. And yet, when the priest glanced at the pages, the parchment remained completely blank. A shiver passed down his spine, an unfamiliar chill that seemed to whisper through the candlelight. He repeated the request, asking the boy to read passages he had never heard, passages he knew existed only in distant manuscripts or in private collections. Each time, the words emerged without hesitation, as if the child were drawing them from some invisible reservoir of knowledge. The parish priest, a man trained to interpret the workings of both God and the devil, felt the weight of the impossible pressing upon him. He questioned the family carefully, seeking to understand whether the boy had been taught, whether there were secret lessons, or perhaps the influence of some unknown tutor. The answers offered little comfort. The boy had never attended school, had never been taught Latin or French, had no access to the texts he now recited. And yet the verses continued to flow, entire paragraphs spoken with clarity, rhythm, and intent. Father Mateo began to record what he heard in a small notebook, his hand shaking slightly as he attempted to reconcile faith with the unfathomable. Word of the boy's readings began to circulate within the parish, whispered from pew to pew during Mass, shared carefully during confessionals, exchanged under the shadows of the church's high arches. Some parishioners murmured that the child was blessed, a vessel of God's divine will, while others speculated that a darker influence was at work. Children reported that he could read their thoughts, or anticipate questions before they were asked. Adults felt an unease that they could not articulate, a creeping sensation that the natural order had been disturbed. Each account amplified the tension, drawing a veil of fear over the village that seemed to thicken with every passing day. Father Mateo wrestled with the contradictions presented by the boy. On one hand, the words he recited were sacred, filled with knowledge and wisdom. On the other, the means of their appearance defied all rational explanation. He sought counsel from neighboring priests and scholars, careful to frame his reports in cautious, respectful terms. Their responses were mixed, some dismissed the phenomenon as clever trickery, the product of hidden ink or sleight of hand. Others warned that miracles often arrived cloaked in fear and confusion, that a child who could perceive invisible text might indeed be chosen for a purpose beyond human comprehension. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Within the parish, debate became inevitable. During sermons, Father Mateo spoke of caution and humility, emphasizing the importance of discernment. He warned villagers to avoid speculation, to refrain from drawing conclusions too quickly. Yet the curiosity persisted, and soon, private gatherings took place outside the walls of the church. Neighbors huddled in kitchens and backyards, quietly observing the boy as he read, debating whether he was a blessing or a portent of misfortune. Even children, naturally drawn to the unusual, pressed their ears to doors and windows, desperate to witness what their parents feared. The boy, for his part, remained unaffected by the growing attention. He did not smile, nor did he appear frightened. When asked to repeat passages, he did so without hesitation, his voice unwavering, his gaze fixed. Yet subtle changes began to manifest. His eyes, once bright and curious, grew heavier, clouded with a fatigue that seemed far beyond his years. Sometimes, when asked to read particularly long or complex passages, his lips trembled slightly, his small hands resting upon the page as if seeking strength from the blank parchment beneath them. It became clear to Father Mateo that the child was under tremendous strain, bearing the weight of knowledge he could neither fully comprehend nor escape. As days passed, the atmosphere within the parish itself seemed to shift. Candles burned longer, shadows stretched unnaturally across the stone walls, and an unspoken tension pervaded every corner. The boy's readings became a lens through which the villagers confronted their deepest fears, their doubts, and their longings. Some interpreted his abilities as evidence of divine providence, others whispered that a darker hand was at work, a force that used innocence as its instrument. Father Mateo, though resolute in his faith, found himself haunted by questions he could not answer, compelled to keep his observations secret even as the boy's reputation grew. By the end of the first week within the parish's awareness, a fragile equilibrium had been established. The villagers, caught between awe and dread, treated the boy with a combination of reverence and caution. Father Mateo continued to monitor him, recording the readings in his private ledger, observing for signs of deception or malign influence. The boy's family, simultaneously protective and fearful, struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy in the face of mounting curiosity and suspicion. And through it all, the words flowed, impossible, invisible, and yet undeniably present, a reminder that some mysteries are too profound to be confined within the boundaries of understanding, and that in the quiet corners of caves, even faith must confront the incomprehensible. As word of the boy's extraordinary abilities spread beyond the farmhouse and parish, the village of Calves found itself caught between fascination and fear. Visitors arrived from neighboring towns, some seeking miracles, others seeking scandal. The boy's readings became a spectacle, an event that drew the curious and the skeptical alike. Doors that had once remained closed were flung open, windows, previously shuttered, now framed silent observers pressing to witness the impossible. Even the simplest gestures, placing a blank book on a table or lighting a candle, were imbued with anticipation, as villagers waited for the invisible ink to reveal itself through the boy's voice. For the boy, this sudden attention was both exhausting and inevitable. He no longer sat before a quiet hearth with only family to witness his gift. Instead, he faced strangers who watched with intense expectation, their eyes unblinking, their breaths held in collective suspense. Sometimes, he read flawlessly, reciting entire passages from memory as if the words were tangible objects hovering just above the blank page. Other times, he faltered. Words became jumbled, sentences fractured, and at rare moments, he trembled as if the effort of drawing invisible letters from the ether weighed upon him physically. These inconsistencies only heightened the sense of the uncanny, reinforcing the notion that his gift was fragile, rare, and dangerous. The reactions of the villagers were divided. Some wept in awe, kneeling before the boy and murmuring prayers of gratitude. They interpreted his ability as divine intervention, proof that the sacred could touch the mundane in a tangible way. Others, however, recoiled, whispering that the child was a conduit for forces they could not name or comprehend. They spoke of curses, of the devil's subtle manipulation, and of the peril in indulging curiosity too freely. Even those who came as skeptics could not ignore the precision with which he delivered passages they themselves could barely recall from memory. It was a tension that held the village in a near-constant state of suspended disbelief. Amid the mounting spectacle, the town council felt compelled to intervene. They feared disorder and the potential for social upheaval. One evening, officials arrived at the farmhouse, declaring that gatherings of such magnitude were to be forbidden. They cited public safety, moral propriety, and the need to protect the village from scandal. Their edicts, however, did little to quell the fascination. People whispered in back alleys, watched from shadows, and sought private audiences with the boy. It was a dynamic of attraction and suppression, a delicate balance between curiosity and prohibition that left the community in a heightened state of unease. Wealthier families, unaccustomed to rural simplicity, became especially intrigued. They sent for the boy to perform in their homes, demanding demonstrations of his abilities. Blank books were carefully prepared, their pages scrutinized by servants and guests alike. Candles were placed to illuminate every corner of the room, ensuring that no hidden mark or trickery could escape detection. In these controlled environments, the boy often excelled, reading flawlessly and astonishing all who watched. Yet even in these moments, a subtle dread lingered. The perfection of his readings made observers aware that the phenomenon existed beyond explanation, a force neither owned nor controlled by human hands. The boy's performance was not always flawless. Occasionally, the words would falter, dissolving into incoherence or omitting critical passages. Villagers interpreted these lapses in myriad ways. Some saw them as evidence of human limitation, a reminder that even miracles had bounds. Others feared it as a warning, a glimpse into the consequences of meddling with forces beyond comprehension. These lapses heightened the tension, creating a fragile theater in which every word spoken was scrutinized, and every silence became pregnant with speculation. In this way, the spectacle itself became a crucible, testing not only the child but the patience, faith, and fear of all who bore witness. Scientific and religious minds alike attempted to rationalize the phenomenon. Scholars examined the books for invisible ink, hidden etchings, or other forms of deception. Priests debated whether the child was blessed or possessed, offering theological interpretations to explain the unexplainable. No conclusion satisfied all parties. Each theory, no matter how logical or devout, fell short when confronted with the raw evidence of the boy's readings. This clash of reasoning and belief only served to deepen the aura of mystery surrounding him, reinforcing the idea that his gift existed outside conventional understanding. The boy's family, meanwhile, became increasingly protective and anxious. They recognized that the attention, while initially harmless, could soon become dangerous. Villagers who once offered curious glances began to speculate openly, attributing motives to the child that were neither innocent nor charitable. The family struggled to shield him, balancing the need for secrecy with the impossibility of hiding such a remarkable ability. Fear and pride intertwined, creating a tension that shadowed every meal, every conversation, every moment of quiet within the farmhouse walls. Ultimately, the spectacle could not be contained. The boy was no longer simply a child in a small village, he had become a symbol, a test of faith, reason, and human curiosity. The blank pages, once mundane, were now stages upon which the extraordinary unfolded. His readings forced the villagers to confront the limits of understanding, the fragility of certainty, and the uncomfortable notion that some mysteries might never be solved. The tension between awe and denial, between fascination and fear, became the heartbeat of Cavs, a rhythm that pulsed through its streets, its homes, and its people. In this delicate balance, the village stood on the edge of revelation and collapse. Every gathering, every reading, every whispered word carried the weight of anticipation and dread. The boy's gift had transformed Cavs into a place of suspended reality, where the line between ordinary life and the inexplicable blurred, and where denial was as inevitable as curiosity. The community faced a choice, to embrace the miracle with humility and fear, or to reject it, risking the unknown consequences of denying that which could not be denied. As weeks turned into months, the boy's readings grew longer, more intricate, and increasingly taxing. What had begun as short passages from sacred texts now encompassed entire letters, historical accounts, and unfamiliar manuscripts, spoken with precision from pages that contained nothing but blank white. The household, once a sanctuary of quiet and measured life, transformed into a chamber of anticipation and trepidation, where every flicker of candlelight seemed to signal the arrival of unseen words. The boy's family began to notice subtle changes in him, the early signs of a burden that weighed upon both body and spirit. The child's eyes, once wide with curiosity, began to carry a shadow of fatigue. His small shoulders slumped slightly under the invisible weight of the texts, and sometimes he would pause mid-recitation, staring at the blank page as if trying to summon strength from some unseen source. Nights were restless, the flickering glow of candles marking hours in which the boy remained awake, whispering passages aloud to empty air while his parents listened in silent awe and mounting fear. The house itself seemed to resonate with the effort, the air thickening, hearth flames flickering in unusual patterns, and the shadows lengthening as if aware of the strain the boy bore. The village too felt the impact of his gift. The stories had spread far enough to attract travelers, scholars, and clerics from distant towns, all eager to witness the phenomenon. Each arrival brought curiosity, but also the subtle weight of expectation. People watched intently, often holding their breath, waiting for him to falter or succeed. The child's readings were no longer simple demonstrations, they became trials of endurance, a test of both his capacity and the community's ability to comprehend what unfolded before them. His performance, flawless in some moments and strained in others, amplified the sense that he was carrying knowledge too vast and too ancient for any single human being to bear. Observers noted that the passages were not merely words. They carried context, emotion, and insight that the boy could not have obtained naturally. He recited histories of far-off towns, described faces of people he had never met, and detailed events that had occurred decades or even centuries before his birth. Those who listened closely began to sense layers of meaning, subtle hints woven into sentences that suggested warnings, guidance, and sometimes sorrowful lamentations. The boy's gift seemed to traverse the boundaries of time and memory, bringing forth knowledge that was at once mesmerizing and burdensome, illuminating and unsettling. Within the household, the emotional toll became evident. The mother's anxiety deepened, her hands trembling as she prepared meals or lit candles, afraid that any distraction might disrupt the boy's delicate balance. The father, practical and grounded, paced the floors at night, struggling to reconcile the extraordinary with the familiar rhythms of life. He worried about the long-term consequences of exposure, the strain on his son's health, and the potential dangers of the village's fascination. Even the priest, Father Mateo, recognized the heavy responsibility that had fallen upon the family and the boy. He documented the readings meticulously, but with each entry, the weight of the unknown pressed upon him as well, leaving him unsettled and restless. The boy himself showed signs of both comprehension and distress. He occasionally spoke of exhaustion, of headaches and dizziness that accompanied extended readings. Sometimes he would pause, his small hands resting lightly on the blank pages, and murmur quietly as if in conversation with voices only he could hear. These murmurs were fragments of thought, expressions of understanding and confusion intertwined. He seemed aware that the knowledge he carried was dangerous, yet unable to resist the compulsion to reveal it. Each recitation brought him closer to an invisible limit, a threshold between insight and despair that neither the family nor the village could measure. Travelers' accounts began to reflect a growing sense of unease. Scholars who arrived expecting marvels left with questions heavy on their minds. Clerics whispered about divine purpose, about burdens placed upon the innocent by forces beyond human comprehension. Some speculated that the boy had been chosen for reasons unknown, a vessel tasked with preserving knowledge lost or hidden. Others feared he had been cursed, marked by an entity that sought to impose wisdom beyond his years, forcing him to bear the consequences of truths the world was not yet prepared to accept. The very act of listening to him seemed to leave an impression on those present, as if the invisible words carried with them a residue of weight, a reminder that knowledge can be both illumination and burden. The phenomenon began to influence the villagers' daily lives. People walked more cautiously along the dusty streets, wary of conversations that might inadvertently provoke revelation. Parents kept their children close, concerned that prolonged exposure might leave them similarly marked. Even the simplest interactions were tinged with caution, the anticipation of invisible words lingering like an unspoken presence. The village, once content in its rhythms of labor and devotion, found itself caught in a state of constant awareness, the boundary between ordinary life and extraordinary perception growing thinner by the day. Yet amidst the weight of knowledge, there were moments of awe and reverence. The boy's readings occasionally revealed passages of remarkable clarity and insight, offering wisdom, moral guidance, or historical reflection that astonished even the most skeptical observers. These moments reinforced the notion that his gift was not merely an oddity but a force with profound significance. Still, each display was tempered by the awareness that such knowledge was not without consequence. Observers felt the strain of comprehension, the subtle exhaustion that accompanied listening to a mind navigating the invisible and the impossible. The family, caught in the tension between pride and fear, struggled to maintain equilibrium. The boy's mother prayed constantly, her rosary slipping through fingers calloused with worry, while the father sought to preserve the structure of ordinary life, attempting to shield his son from excessive exposure without denying the undeniable. Even Father Mateo, tasked with spiritual guidance, recognized the impossibility of total protection. He cautioned villagers against obsession, while secretly fearing that the boy's gift carried an unmeasured cost, one that would be borne not just by the child but by all who witnessed it. In this delicate balance, it became clear that the weight of knowledge was not borne solely by the boy. The villagers themselves were complicit participants, absorbing fragments of understanding too vast for a single mind. Each reading, each recitation, left an impression that lingered in memory, shaping thoughts, fears, and expectations. The invisible words, spoken aloud, created ripples that extended far beyond the walls of the farmhouse, influencing the village in ways that were subtle, cumulative, and profoundly unsettling. By the end of the season, it was apparent that the boy carried a burden that transcended ordinary comprehension. The words he read, though unseen, exerted influence upon all who encountered them, reshaping perception, challenging faith, and illuminating the precarious boundary between innocence and responsibility. In the small village of Calves, life had irrevocably shifted, and the weight of knowledge, carried upon the fragile shoulders of a single child, would define the village's fate in ways both wondrous and terrifying. As the boy's readings continued, the village of Calves, along with visitors from distant towns, sought rational explanations. Scholars and clergy alike arrived, determined to reconcile the impossible with reason and faith. They brought with them books, instruments, and theories, convinced that some hidden mechanism or natural phenomenon must account for the phenomenon. Yet every attempt to explain the child's gift only deepened the mystery. What they encountered defied conventional understanding, leaving even the most learned observers uncertain, frustrated, and at times, terrified. The first line of inquiry focused on the material itself. Blank pages were examined meticulously, scrutinized for invisible ink, faint scratches, or subtle indentations that might carry hidden messages. Light was passed over each sheet, magnifying glasses and rudimentary lenses employed to detect any trace of deception. Servants and assistants turned over every book, shaking them, sniffing for chemicals, even brushing the pages with soot to reveal hidden marks. Yet nothing was discovered. The books remained pure, unmarked, empty. And still, the words emerged through the child, as precise and complete as if the text had existed in some parallel dimension all along. Some visitors proposed that the boy possessed an extraordinary memory, perhaps having overheard or glimpsed texts without his parents' knowledge. This theory, while plausible at first glance, quickly collapsed under scrutiny. He recited passages from languages he had never learned, letters from places he had never visited, and histories from eras that predated his birth. Even the most advanced memory could not account for such comprehensive knowledge, especially from sources the child had no opportunity to encounter. The scholars who attempted to test him in controlled settings were left bewildered, watching as he flawlessly delivered texts that had never physically existed in their presence. Others turned to theology for explanation. Clerics argued that the boy might be divinely inspired, chosen to carry knowledge that had been hidden from the world, a vessel of providence. Some speculated that God's wisdom had been entrusted to an innocent mind, and that the child's gift was meant to illuminate truths that humanity had forgotten or overlooked. These interpretations offered comfort to some, but even within faith, uncertainty persisted. The very act of reciting invisible words raised profound questions about agency, morality, and the relationship between divine will and human comprehension. Observers found themselves balancing reverence with fear, unsure whether the boy was blessed or burdened, whether they were witnessing a miracle or an omen. The possibility of supernatural interference, beyond divine providence, was considered in hushed tones. Some villagers whispered of spirits, demons, or ancestral entities imparting knowledge to the child. They recalled old folktales of children touched by otherworldly forces, of invisible messages delivered under the cover of night, and of gifts that carried hidden costs. These interpretations were never spoken aloud in the parish, yet they lingered in corners, kitchens, and back alleys, shaping the way the villagers perceived every reading. The boy's presence became a mirror, reflecting both hope and fear, and revealing the unspoken anxieties that simmered beneath the town's polite surface. Attempts at scientific reasoning, though rudimentary, proved equally ineffective. Scholars brought small instruments designed to test pressure, moisture, and chemical reactions, searching for mechanisms that might cause letters to appear on blank paper. Some tried to elicit responses through distraction or repeated questioning, hoping that the child's performance might falter under pressure. Yet the boy read consistently, the words flowing naturally, without hesitation, pause, or error. Each failed attempt at explanation further mystified those who came expecting reason, leaving them with the unsettling impression that they were confronting a phenomenon outside the bounds of earthly understanding. The boy's family struggled alongside the observers, torn between protecting him and satisfying the curiosity of outsiders. Their home became a testing ground, a place where questions were posed, experiments attempted, and observations meticulously recorded. They watched as strangers attempted to categorize, measure, or predict the child's abilities, only to find themselves confounded. Each recitation became an event, a performance that combined precision, endurance, and subtle defiance of logic. For the family, pride was inseparable from fear. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, yet painfully aware of the burdens it imposed on the boy. Even as the village and visitors searched for explanations, subtle patterns began to emerge, though they were far from conclusive. Occasionally, the child's readings would touch on events of local significance, matters that seemed to echo the collective memory of the village. At other times, the passages contained warnings or moral reflections that resonated in unexpected ways. Scholars documented these moments meticulously, attempting to infer rules or underlying systems. Yet the patterns were inconsistent, elusive, and incomplete. The invisible words appeared to operate on principles that eluded every method of inquiry, reinforcing the sense that the boy's gift existed in a domain beyond observation, analysis, or control. As frustration grew among the learned visitors, some began to reject the phenomenon outright. They accused the family of deception, claimed that imagination or subtle coaching explained the readings, and dismissed the boy's abilities as illusion. But even in denial, the evidence persisted. Attempts to replicate failures or inconsistencies were met with success, and no human artifice could account for the breadth, depth, and accuracy of the recited texts. Doubt could not erase what was heard, and disbelief could not silence what was revealed. Each failed theory served only to deepen the sense of wonder, unease, and inevitable confrontation with the incomprehensible. Ultimately, the village was left with a profound truth: the boy's gift could not be contained within the familiar frameworks of science, reason, or religion. Every attempt to explain, to categorize, to measure, or to control the phenomenon faltered. The readings continued, precise and unerring, yet impossible to reconcile with what the human mind expected or required. In this failure, the villagers faced the unsettling reality that some mysteries exist not to be solved, but to illuminate the limits of understanding, and to force acknowledgement of forces and knowledge that lie beyond the ordinary. As the months wore on, the village of calves began to feel the cumulative weight of the boy's gift. What had initially inspired awe and cautious curiosity now seeded tension, fear, and uncertainty among the villagers. The daily gatherings, once bustling with observers and neighbors, became smaller, more hesitant, as families chose to avoid the farmhouse altogether. Whispered conversations replaced public discussion, and a subtle pall settled over the community. The boys' readings, which had once been a spectacle, were now a burden, drawing attention that some found impossible to reconcile with ordinary life. The boy himself grew increasingly withdrawn. The strain of constantly producing words from blank pages, of bearing knowledge far beyond his years, began to manifest visibly. He spoke less during casual moments, retreating into quiet corners of the farmhouse or lingering near the hearth, where shadows seemed to embrace him like old friends. His eyes, once wide with the curiosity of childhood, became deep pools reflecting the pressure of invisible burdens. Even when surrounded by family, he sometimes seemed absent, as if his mind had wandered to distant places described in the passages he recited, a realm only he could perceive. The family attempted to shield him from excessive attention, yet the boy's renown had reached a point where isolation was impossible. Scholars, priests, and curious travelers continued to arrive, persistent despite warnings and refusals. Attempts to enforce distance were met with polite insistence, veiled impatience, or outright defiance. The household became a delicate theater of control, where the family struggled to maintain some semblance of normal life while protecting the child from overexposure. Each encounter left him visibly exhausted, small hands trembling as he read yet another passage, the invisible ink exacting a toll that only those closest could discern. The village's social structure also began to falter. Relationships strained under the weight of secrecy and fear. Neighbors who once shared meals or exchanged greetings now kept their distance, uncertain how to engage with a household that seemed suspended between ordinary life and incomprehensible phenomena. Children who once played near the farmhouse hesitated at its edges, their curiosity tempered by stories of invisible words and whispered warnings. Even the parish priest, Father Mateo, found his role complicated, torn between spiritual guidance, protection of the boy, and the need to maintain public trust. His own sense of balance grew tenuous, as the responsibilities of oversight became heavier than any ordinary pastoral duty. The psychological effects on the boy were profound. Observers noted moments of visible strain, sudden pauses mid-recitation, small shivers running through his body, a distant expression that suggested he was negotiating with forces beyond understanding. He occasionally murmured to himself, quiet exchanges with invisible interlocutors that left family and witnesses alike uncertain whether he was conversing with memory, imagination, or some presence unseen. Nights were especially difficult, as the boy sometimes remained awake for hours, whispering passages to the darkened room, his voice carrying an intensity that filled every corner of the farmhouse. Sleep became scarce, meals were often neglected, and the fragile rhythms of childhood were disrupted by demands his mind could not refuse. With the boy's withdrawal came increasing isolation of the family itself. Visits dwindled, both out of caution and fear. The once bustling farmhouse became quieter, almost spectral, as those who remained reluctant to enter watched from a distance. The villagers, cautious of exposing themselves to the incomprehensible, maintained polite distance, observing only from the threshold of roads or through shutters. Scholars and clerics, frustrated by the boy's declining ability to perform consistently, departed quietly, leaving the family alone with the child's unrelenting gift. The household became a microcosm of tension, a place where attention and avoidance coexisted, where the burden of knowledge was both a blessing and a torment. Isolation did not diminish the intensity of the boy's readings. On the contrary, with fewer observers, the sessions sometimes became longer, as if the absence of external pressure allowed the invisible words to flow more freely. He read in silence at first, the only sound the faint rustle of pages and the subtle tremor of his voice. Passages that once took minutes now extended into hours, with histories, letters, and verses weaving together into narratives that spanned generations. Each session drew more heavily on his energy, leaving him pale, fatigued, and withdrawn, yet compelled to continue as though some invisible force demanded completion. The village, now distanced both physically and emotionally, began to perceive the household as separate from ordinary life. Gossip gave way to a tacit recognition that the boy and his family occupied a realm beyond the comprehension of neighbors. Curiosity remained, but it was tempered by fear and respect. Even those who once attempted to understand, rationalize, or explain the readings eventually yielded to the realization that some phenomena were beyond observation and interference. The household became an island of quiet intensity, set apart not only by the child's gift but by the collective decision of the village to respect, or perhaps avoid, what could not be contained. The psychological atmosphere of the farmhouse became dense with anticipation, awe, and dread. Every blank page seemed charged with possibility, every candle flicker a silent signal of what might emerge. The boy's family navigated a delicate equilibrium, balancing encouragement, protection, and the acknowledgement of extraordinary circumstances. Meals were eaten in near silence, conversations carefully measured, and any disturbance avoided. The home itself became attuned to the rhythms of invisible words, the very walls seemingly aware of the pressures imposed upon its smallest inhabitant. Even isolation could not fully protect the boy from the broader consequences of his gift. Occasionally, his voice carried beyond the windows and doors, snippets of unseen text reaching the ears of wandering villagers. Those who overheard spoke of chills, unease, and reverence, reinforcing the duality of fascination and fear. The household remained a place of delicate tension, where knowledge demanded both attention and avoidance, and where the consequences of visibility were weighed against the necessity of existence. The collapse of ordinary life in the village, mirrored in the boy's gradual withdrawal, marked a turning point. The child's gift had begun to reshape the very structure of community, perception, and daily reality. By the end of this period, it was clear that the boy's gift could neither be celebrated openly nor entirely hidden. The collapse of social engagement, the strain upon family dynamics, and the psychological weight borne by the child demonstrated that some knowledge comes at an unbearable cost. Caves, once a modest village of labor and devotion, had been irrevocably altered. Its people, scholars, and clergy alike were forced to confront the profound tension between understanding and preservation, curiosity and restraint, and between the extraordinary burden of invisible words and the human need for equilibrium. The boy's isolation became both protection and prison, a necessary condition for survival, yet a poignant reminder that some gifts are inseparable from sacrifice. When the boy's readings finally began to wane, the village of Caves felt the full impact of the prolonged phenomenon. The once bustling gatherings, filled with whispered anticipation and cautious awe, dissolved into an uneasy quiet. The farmhouse, which had been the epicenter of fascination, became a place of tentative distance, as if the air itself had absorbed the extraordinary and now retained a lingering weight. Residents spoke less of the events, offering polite nods in place of conversation, and the once curious travelers ceased their visits, leaving the family to navigate the consequences of their son's gift in relative solitude. The boy's family, though relieved that the intensity of attention had diminished, remained deeply changed. The child himself carried signs of fatigue, his small frame bearing the subtle physical effects of prolonged strain. Nights remained restless. He would sometimes sit silently before blank pages, murmuring passages under his breath as though he could not entirely detach from the invisible knowledge he had carried for months. His mother, ever vigilant, continued her prayers with a quiet intensity, asking for strength, protection, and a measure of peace for her child. The father, meanwhile, attempted to restore routines disrupted by months of social scrutiny, though even simple tasks felt infused with a residual tension that no normality could fully dispel. The villagers' response was one of cautious distance rather than celebration. Children, once fascinated, were kept away from the farmhouse, guided instead toward ordinary play and familiar routines. Adults refrained from discussing the boy openly, wary of stirring dormant fear or attracting unwanted attention. Even the parish priest, Father Mateo, respected this silence, emphasizing humility and discretion in his sermons, and subtly reinforcing the understanding that some knowledge is too potent to expose recklessly. The village adapted to a collective reticence, a form of preservation born from both reverence and unease. Despite the quiet, the boy's gift left a lasting impression on those who had witnessed it. Scholars recorded their observations meticulously, yet each manuscript carried the implicit acknowledgement of failure. The readings could not be explained, catalogued, or replicated. Clerics reflected on the child's role in the broader tapestry of faith, pondering whether divine intervention had been temporary or whether it had left an enduring, subtle imprint upon the community. The combination of awe, fear, and uncertainty created a lingering atmosphere that could be felt in the quiet moments of daily life, in the way villagers glanced toward the farmhouse, or paused at familiar crossroads, recalling the impossible words they had once heard. The phenomenon also sparked a profound transformation in perception. Ordinary events were now filtered through the lens of memory and speculation. A simple conversation about harvests, weather, or market days could evoke recollections of the boy's recitations. People found themselves wondering whether seemingly mundane interactions contained hidden significance, whether their own thoughts might someday manifest in the extraordinary, or whether some subtle link existed between their consciousness and the invisible knowledge once spoken aloud. The village's collective imagination, tempered by respect and fear, became more reflective, more attentive, and more cautious, a quiet testimony to the enduring presence of something beyond comprehension. Local silence, however, was not mere avoidance. It became a form of reverence, a subtle acknowledgement of the extraordinary. Families who had once approached the farmhouse with curiosity now maintained polite distance, their silence serving as a protective barrier, both for themselves and for the boy. This quietude extended to rituals of daily life, work in the fields, domestic chores, and communal gatherings all carried an unspoken mindfulness, a tacit acknowledgement that some phenomena, once encountered, demand reflection rather than discussion. In this way, the village adapted, cultivating a culture of muted respect, in which extraordinary knowledge was acknowledged without confrontation, celebrated in memory rather than in practice. Even travelers who returned home carried the imprint of the boy's readings. Letters, diaries, and oral accounts described the events with a mixture of awe and restraint, emphasizing the impossibility of the phenomenon and the quiet dignity of the family. These accounts circulated slowly, sometimes years later, contributing to a broader understanding of the incident while preserving the aura of mystery. The story became a local legend, passed down in hushed tones, always acknowledging the delicate balance between revelation and restraint. Each retelling preserved both the wonder and the burden of the boy's gift, ensuring that the legacy endured without intruding on everyday life. Father Mateo, reflecting privately on the events, recognized that the silence served a deeper purpose. By refraining from public commentary or sensationalism, the village allowed the boy's gift to exist within a controlled space, reducing the risk of exploitation or harm. The absence of spectacle reinforced the sacredness of what had occurred. Knowledge, he realized, can be both illuminating and destructive. The restraint shown by the village preserved the possibility of reflection, understanding, and spiritual integration. In this sense, silence became a form of wisdom, a protective measure that allowed extraordinary events to resonate without overwhelming ordinary life. The boy himself, though quieter, carried forward an awareness of the invisible words. While the intensity of his readings diminished, the imprint of knowledge remained within him, subtle yet unmistakable. Observers noted moments when he paused, eyes distant, as if recalling passages no one else could hear. He spoke less of them, yet his demeanor suggested a mind enriched, and burdened, by experiences beyond ordinary comprehension. In this way, the aftermath of the phenomenon was not only a village-wide adjustment but an internal, ongoing negotiation within the child himself, a testament to the enduring influence of invisible knowledge. Ultimately, the aftermath and local silence became intertwined. The village retained the memory of the extraordinary without allowing it to dominate daily life. The family remained vigilant yet relieved, protecting the boy and allowing him space to recover. Scholars departed with unanswered questions, clerics carried reflections on divine purpose, and villagers absorbed lessons in humility and restraint. The story persisted as both a legend and a cautionary tale, an enduring reminder that some gifts are too profound, too complex, or too fragile to be subjected to constant observation or explanation. Through silence, Cavs preserved balance, allowing both the extraordinary and the ordinary to coexist. The boy's readings, though no longer performed with frequency, continued to shape perception, memory, and understanding. The invisible words, once spoken aloud, left traces in the minds of those who had witnessed them, an enduring echo of knowledge that could not be fully grasped, yet could not be forgotten. In this quiet aftermath, the village found a new rhythm, one in which reverence, fear, and reflection merged, allowing life to continue while honoring the weight and wonder of what had transpired. Even after the boys' readings ceased to dominate daily life in Cavs, the questions they raised lingered, casting long shadows across the minds of villagers, scholars, and clergy alike. Every visitor who had witnessed the invisible words departed with a mixture of awe, frustration, and humility, realizing that no single explanation could account for what they had experienced. In the quiet years that followed, debate persisted. Some sought rational explanations, others sought spiritual meaning, yet none could reconcile the phenomenon completely. It became clear that the event was as much a challenge to perception as it was a historical curiosity, a mirror reflecting the limits of human understanding. Scholars continued to speculate, revisiting the records meticulously kept by the boy's family and Father Mateo. They examined the books, the patterns of recitation, and the circumstances surrounding each reading, searching for clues that might reveal natural mechanisms. Some proposed theories of heightened intuition, rare cognitive abilities, or subconscious memory that reached beyond conventional education. Others suggested that the boy's mind somehow accessed collective memory, drawing on traces of oral history, folklore, or even the latent consciousness of previous generations. Yet no hypothesis could account fully for the precision, depth, and complexity of the readings, nor explain the passages from languages and cultures entirely foreign to him. Religious interpretations remained equally varied. Some clergy maintained that the boy had been chosen for a divine purpose, a vessel through which sacred knowledge flowed to enlighten those who were willing to perceive it. Others argued that he had been touched by providence temporarily, his gift a test not only for himself but for the entire village, a reminder that the sacred often manifests in unexpected and incomprehensible ways. Sermons, letters, and personal reflections emphasized the need for humility, suggesting that the limits of human understanding are inherent and that attempts to fully grasp divine intention are, by design, incomplete. These reflections, while comforting to some, left lingering tension, highlighting the delicate balance between faith, observation, and mystery. Among the villagers, memory of the boy's readings evolved into legend, a story passed down in hushed tones and reflective conversations. Each retelling carried subtle embellishments, invisible words becoming prophetic, passages revealing personal significance, or the boy himself portrayed as a fragile prophet. The legend reinforced the sense that the extraordinary had been real, yet the precise mechanics remained deliberately opaque. Silence, both communal and personal, became a form of preservation, a way to respect the child's privacy while acknowledging the phenomenon's enduring influence. Over time, even those who had initially expressed skepticism began to recognize that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only witnessed and remembered. Attempts at scientific study, though limited by the era's rudimentary tools, continued in private correspondence and treatises. Scholars debated whether the phenomenon could be replicated or understood through measurement and observation. They considered the possibility of mental projection, unrecognized cognitive skill, or environmental influence, yet each theory faltered when confronted with the empirical records of flawless recitations and accurate historical accounts. The failure to explain the readings scientifically reinforced the notion that human knowledge is constrained, that certain phenomena exist outside the predictable, and that some truths may be intangible, revealing themselves only in fragments or under conditions impossible to fully recreate. The question of origin became a central theme in discussions of the boy's gift. Some suggested that the ability was innate, a rare cognitive or spiritual endowment unique to him. Others speculated that it was the result of ancestral influence, passed through generations in ways invisible to ordinary perception. A few considered mystical or supernatural intervention, suggesting that forces beyond the human sphere had chosen the child as a vessel for knowledge that was otherwise inaccessible. Each theory carried its own implications, philosophical and ethical, yet none could be confirmed. The boy's readings remained a point of convergence for competing ideas, each reflecting the limits of human understanding, imagination, and belief. Observers also noted the social and psychological dimensions of the phenomenon. The village, already transformed by months of attention and isolation, had adapted to a delicate equilibrium between curiosity and restraint. The boy's readings had not only revealed invisible words but had illuminated the fragility of social cohesion, the dynamics of fear and fascination, and the subtle ways in which extraordinary events reshape communities. In reflecting on the aftermath, historians and theorists alike emphasize that the impact of the readings extended beyond the words themselves, influencing memory, perception, and the structures of daily life. The village's silence, its measured distance, and the careful preservation of the boy's privacy were as significant as the content of his recitations. Despite extensive analysis, unanswered questions persisted. Why had the boy been able to access knowledge seemingly unattainable by any ordinary means? What forces, natural, spiritual, or otherwise, had allowed the invisible words to manifest? Could the phenomenon recur in others, or was it a singular event in history? And perhaps most importantly, what was the ultimate purpose of such knowledge? These questions haunted those who had witnessed the readings firsthand, lingering in personal diaries, scholarly essays, and private reflection. Even in the absence of repetition, the boy's gift continued to challenge assumptions, forcing acknowledgement that some events resist categorization and demand humility in the face of mystery. Legends and rumors persisted in the region, sometimes diverging from recorded fact, but always retaining a core truth: that a child had read words that were not there, that knowledge had been made visible without physical inscription, and that observers had been irrevocably changed by the experience. The boy's name became entwined with the idea of the inexplicable, and Caves itself was forever associated with an event that blended history, mystery, and human fascination. Scholars and clergy alike recognized that the story served as a reminder of the interplay between curiosity, reverence, and the limits of comprehension, a narrative that continued to captivate generations. Ultimately, the boy's readings remain an unresolved chapter in the annals of history. They defy categorization, resist conventional explanation, and inhabit a liminal space between reality and legend, science and faith, innocence and burden. Each account, whether recorded meticulously by scholars, remembered by villagers, or whispered as legend, carries the weight of wonder and uncertainty. The invisible words, once spoken aloud, endure in memory, leaving traces that challenge perception and invite reflection on the fragile boundary between knowledge and mystery. In this, the legacy of the Boy of Caves persists, an enduring testament to the limits of understanding and the enduring power of the inexplicable. In the final analysis, observers and theorists alike confront a fundamental truth: some phenomena exist not to be solved, but to illuminate the boundaries of human comprehension. The boy's readings serve as a reminder that knowledge can be both a gift and a burden, that the extraordinary often arrives unbidden, and that silence, reflection, and humility are necessary responses to encounters that exceed ordinary perception. The unresolved questions remain, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, yet their very presence ensures that the story endures, compelling reflection and wonder for generations yet to come.